I've titled this lecture Marxism, Dead but Not Forgotten. And I think here perhaps there are echoes somewhere within me of an American boy of the 1950s, assuming that if it's Marxism, it's bad, and that's the end of it. It's very difficult to bring a balanced, entirely neutral perspective to bear on Karl Marx or Marxism. We do associate much of the second half of the 20th century politically with the writings and teachings of Karl Marx. And I think in this we probably either pay him too much credit or heap far too much scorn on him. Much of what comes down to us as Marxism is by way of Mao Zedong and Lenin and Stalin and the like. And in these characters there is very little that matches up with the depth of Marx's own systematic writings. I'm also somewhat reluctant to talk about Karl Marx in a series of lectures titled Great Ideas in Philosophy, chiefly because Karl Marx was quite assiduous in declaring that he was not a philosopher. Indeed, he had a certain, well, I don't want to call it contempt for philosophy, but he thought philosophy had an expiration date on it. He thought that philosophical speculation was really an activity that goes on because of the undeveloped nature of societies, because of the purely habitual modes of social organization. That indeed a successful scheme of social revolution would put an end to that. In fact, once society was on a footing that bore some relationship to reality, philosophical speculation would go the way of tarot cards and astrology. Marx regarded himself as a social scientist, making contributions chiefly to economic and social theory. He regarded his method and his mode of explanation as drawn from the sciences, and specifically not philosophy. Nonetheless, his ideas have animated philosophical discourse almost since the time they were recorded on paper, and there are whole departments, in fact until quite recently, whole departments in Central Europe and in what used to be called the Soviet Union, devoted to little more than composing glosses on one or another Marxist tract. So there's no doubt whatever but that Karl Marx thought what he was doing, his principal contributions, that is, would be to that part of the history of ideas in which we find philosophy itself, his protestations to the contrary notwithstanding. Marx's dates are 1818 to 1883. He was born in Prussia to a middle-class family that claimed a long line of rabbis. To preserve his successful law practice, Marx's father had converted to Protestantism. His son, Karl, followed in his father's footsteps, matriculating in Bonn University's Faculty of Law at the age of 17. And it was there that he met and became engaged to a daughter of the aristocracy, Jenny von Westphalen. Shortly after, his studies take place at the University of Berlin, where he joins the young Hegelians, a momentous event in his intellectual development. His radicalism made an academic career impossible, but found a nurturing medium in journalism. So at the young age of 26, he is appointed editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, and he will guide it quickly toward dissolution at the hands of Prussian authorities. If you want to get a newspaper closed down at this time, Marx is the chap you want as your editor. Well, the editor of the paper sought an enlargement of liberty next in France, from which, in about 2 years, he was expelled. Here's Marx again. His movements with faithful Jenny and a growing family were frequent, sometimes fitful, until he finally would settle in London. Actually, he's buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. So you do get the picture of this fellow born to be a revolutionary and finding no home genial to his presence very long. Now, of his contributions as a scientist, social or otherwise, I would have to judge them to be negligible when compared with their influence. Little of what Marx offered would even be testable, and such predictions as he made, when at all specific, were disconfirmed with extraordinary regularity. Marx's estimation of himself as a scientist, therefore, I would have to say, is an exaggeration, or perhaps an expression of an aspiration more than an achievement. He earns less dubiously the title of non-philosopher, if this is some sort of distinction, for he did pay rather little attention to systematic philosophies and the abiding problems in philosophy. Let's take as an example the mind-body problem, which surely is an abiding problem in philosophy. How is human nature to be understood? Is it ultimately a congeries of biological, physiological processes, the brain being centrally responsible for thought, action, and the like? Or is there something of transcendence about our humanity such that we rise above the level of mere matter? Well, when Marx briefly engages an issue like this, you can almost feel his impatience. Why, in the times he lives in, anyone would pause to consider a matter of that kind simply amazes him. Amidst the European revolutions of 1848, the idea of sitting around and asking a question like that would have struck Karl Marx as an example of how effete thought and thinkers had become by the mid-19th century. Now, he does pause in the Holy Family to record his satisfaction with, of all solutions, Gassendi's solution to the mind-body problem. Recall what Gassendi's position was. It was a thoroughgoing, materialistic theory of mind, a physiological theory of mind and mental life. Note that Marx's PhD dissertation, his doctoral dissertation, was on Democritus and Epicurus. The title of the dissertation was, quote, "The Difference Between the Democritean and the Epicurean Philosophy of Nature," close quote. In his draft of a new preface to the dissertation, he says this about Pierre Gassendi, quote, "Gassendi freed Epicurus from the interdict which the fathers of the Church had placed upon him. He seeks to accommodate his Catholic conscience to his pagan knowledge, and Epicurus to the Church, which certainly was a wasted effort," close quote. So again, you see the reaction against religion, the idea that Gassendi is trying to achieve some sort of rapprochement between a pagan materialist philosophy and the church of which he was a member. The whole project was wasted. But at least what we see in Marx is the solution to the mind-body problem, as far as he's concerned, is already in. It's materialistic. So he was, at least early on, interested in materialistic philosophies in the stricter sense of materialism. Surely taking on a project like that for a doctoral dissertation shows not only an interest in such questions, but an early allegiance to a particular approach to solving problems of that kind. And perhaps it also reveals the influence of his teacher, Feuerbach, whose own war on religion and tradition was as incessant as was Marx's. Marx in 1844 would declare Feuerbach to be, quote, "the true conqueror of the old philosophy," close quote. As a leader of the young Hegelians, Feuerbach attacked what he identified as Hegel's idealism. He agitated for a more thoroughly biological understanding of human nature, and he relentlessly assailed religion and its social influence. His Essence of Christianity reduces reality to man and nature, with no room left over for what he takes to be the fantastic ontology of the religious mind. It would not be too much to say, no Feuerbach, no Marx. Well, both were materialists. But if we were to classify Marx as a materialist, it would be a different kind of materialist. It would be what he himself referred to as a dialectical materialist, more in the tradition of Hegel. Marx and Engels claim to have, quote, "stood Hegel on his head," close quote. But they were both early admirers of and intellectual disciples of Hegelian philosophy. The difference between a dialectical materialism and the sort I've spoken of in lectures in this series is that the latter tends to be grounded in mechanistic considerations. Considerations that would be quite at home, for example, with Newtonian science or with Galileo or with the atomism of Democritus or with Epicurus. Dialectical materialism is different. It retains the materialistic ontology of philosophical materialism, but then accounts for all change in terms of what? The struggle of opposites. It's on this basis that progress becomes possible, change through conflict. The same forces are at work within societies, where under the laws now of historical materialism, human character is shaped by the material modes of production. Hegel, recall, based reality itself on the dialectic, with the absolute idea realizing itself through human history. Now, in Hegel's philosophy, there occurs a transcendent and not a material mode of progress. It's not at the level of mere earthly materiality that progress takes place. The absolute stands at the rational foundation of historical developments, so it's reason realizing itself in human history. Thus, the Hegelian scheme is a cosmic scheme based on some abstract, rational, or intelligent precept that does its silent work in the world. Historical processes now become emblems, as it were, or bits of evidence of what's taking place behind the scenes. Marx and Engels dismiss the idealism, declaring Hegel to be, quote, standing on his head, and accepting for themselves the duty to place Hegel's feet back on terra firma. So one begins by abandoning the whole field of absolute egos and absolute ideas, and attaching oneself instead to a dialectical materialism in which the events of the social and political world are brought about by factors which are at base not transcendent, but economic. Economic forces are not the sole determinants of social dynamics and individual behavior, but they are the dominant forces. As biological entities, people are motivated from the first by the needs of the body, not by philosophical or moral abstractions, but by the creature needs that arise from their very materiality. The Darwinian model was a source of inspiration here. Karl Marx wrote that, quote, Darwin's work serves me as a natural scientific basis for the class struggle in history. He went so far as to dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin. We have no evidence to suggest that Darwin was in any way pleased by this. Now, in proposing that it's economics that imposes change on societies and on persons, Marxism represents a reversal of the traditional way of looking at how systems and institutions come about. Aristotle, for example, argued that the political and legal framework of society will shape the moral character of citizens, and that this, and surely not anything economic, represents the decisive factor in social life. So on an Aristotelian account, the laws and institutions of the polis are established to achieve certain ends. In the right polis, these are the ends of virtue. For Thomas Aquinas, law is, recall, an ordinance of reason, promulgated by one who has the good of the community at heart, or who is responsible for the good of the community. Social organization on this understanding is again based on ends that serve the dictates of conscience. The economics of the situation would be just a surface phenomenon and not at the center of objectives of this sort. Now, the Marxist version turns this quite around. What you begin with are the productive resources that a tribal enclave, a small community, or indeed an entire empire might claim for itself. This inevitably recruits the physical powers of a laboring class. The laboring class becomes an instrument by which production becomes possible. Now, in the process, things are produced more efficiently by cooperation, as the agricultural yield works to the advantage of all. In time, however, possession of property is taken, this establishing class distinctions between the propertied class and the laborers who are working the property. It becomes necessary for the propertied class to devise some means by which to safeguard their possessions. Hence, this same class proceeds to write the laws and exact the punishments. So for the Marxist, law is a class concept, a class tool arising from the material interdependencies of bourgeois and proletarian classes. With the rise of capitalism and the disappearance of feudal society, the process works in an almost mechanical way. Now, suppose we want to accumulate capital, which is what capitalism is all about. We want to accumulate wealth. Now, the way you accumulate wealth is by seeing to it that you can sell something for a price that exceeds the cost of producing it. Well, what this requires is that the cost of producing it, which is primarily the cost of labor, has to be kept as low as possible relative to the price that will be charged for the product in question. The difference between the cost of the labor involved in producing something and the price that is won in selling it just is the profit. This is what you're trying to amass. Well, now suppose it turns out that everybody in the world can make shoes. Well, of course, if everyone in the world can make shoes, then no one has to buy shoes. If it were the case that a large number of people in the world were making shoes, there would be far too many shoes for the number of feet in the world. Now you begin to see that the price you'll be able to get for a pair of shoes drops as the supply becomes entirely disproportionate vis-a-vis the need for the item. So within a capitalist system, it becomes necessary to control the means of production, to make sure that production does not significantly outstrip need. This requires an accumulation of power over the primary mode of production. What is the primary mode of production? Labor. So what you now have is the formation of sharply distinguished classes. There is a laboring class, but the laboring class now is understood to be a kind of device. It's like an assembly line. It's like a system of pulleys. Labor is something that makes things, just as machinery makes things. As with machinery, it's necessary to keep labor, as it were, in good repair, and also make provision for replenishing the supply of it. And this is precisely what wages are all about. Wages aren't paid out of some consideration of obligation or decency. Wages instead are the means by which labor is preserved. Indeed, wages become the means by which labor reproduces itself. You form a laboring class, which in almost clone-like fashion is kept in such a condition of life that its offspring are likely to enter the same mode of employment, engage in the same productive enterprises, and be kept at a subsistence or slightly above subsistence level in order for the productive resources of the society to be used to their fullest. My, oh my. Now, if you happen to be at the top of the food chain, so to speak, in this enterprise, you've got to see to it that your interests are protected. Your interests are protected chiefly by law. So there is a hand-in-glove relationship between those who are most successful at forming capital and commanding the productive resources of the community, and those who are responsible for writing and indeed implementing the laws. They are mutually self-serving. They are serving each other, serving important ends. The legislative and executive activity within such a context might just be another of the tools for the exploitation of the laboring classes. Certainly at this point you understand what the Marxist interpretation, what the Marxist philosophy of law is going to look like. And it is alive and well in many of our law schools. Now, the reaction to unionization in the 19th century was just the sort of datum that Marx could adduce in support of his theory. The idea that the law is being used fairly to distribute resources and to compensate persons in proportion to the value of their work was routinely violated everywhere that Marx looked, everywhere in the European world. What Marx found in feudal society was a system in which the pattern of dependencies was rather more homogeneous than what would obtain when capitalism replaced feudalism. I might mention at this point that Marx has a surprising, well, perhaps not surprisingly, Marx has a very positive attitude toward feudal societies and the medieval world itself. Has to be replaced, but he does see in it something that is replaced by capitalism in the worst sense of being replaced. The feudal lord is not amassing capital. He's not amassing power. He seeks instead to attain a kind of status compatible with a certain religious worldview. At least at the public and social level, then, his aim is to preserve what has been achieved. To do this, however, he recognizes not only the need for labor, but recognizes also the very nobility of labor. He lives within a society in which class structure is not a measure of a person's worth, but a reflection rather of what the divinely intended order of the cosmos would bring about. Now, Marx has his criticism of feudal society, not to mention of the church it served. But for all the criticism that he heaps on modern economic systems and on modern society itself, he does pause in his writings to make comparisons with a feudal mode of economy and social organization. Those comparisons are, I say, always to the advantage of the feudal society, its economics, its mode of social organization. On Marx's account, the movement from feudalism to capitalism is quite complex, the two existing side by side for periods of time. The undoing of feudal society arises from its very success. For with security and life's basics provided, there is a growing desire for new goods. As the feudal estate prospers, there's greater opportunity for trade, and this brings to the attention of the laboring class possibilities previously hidden. Again, the dialectic. Now, there are feudal guilds that are formed by skilled laborers who will limit production to keep prices high. Against this are the rising expectations associated with economic security, rising expectations that can be met only by manufactured goods produced in quantity at rates that the feudal craftsman couldn't possibly match. But manufacturing requires now a division of labor and essentially the end of craftsmanship itself. The unskilled laborer replaces the craftsman, and capital formation proceeds at an accelerating clip, thanks now to cheaper labor and the concentrated ownership of the very modes of production. What does this lead to? Well, unchecked, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and alas, revolution is the only remedy. QED. Now, what is capital? Well, according to the labor theory of value, in capitalism, labor produces more than what is paid for it. And the surplus or remainder or difference yields capital. Of course, this works only insofar as there are consumers. According to the theory, for capitalism to survive, it must continue to expand. The consumer class must be increased. I often wonder what Marx, if revived and traipsed through a contemporary shopping mall, say the Mall of America, might say. He might just smile and declare himself utterly vindicated. The main point, however, is this. Unlike a feudal mode of production, the progressive capitalistic mode of acquisition of wealth, the formation of capital, has to grow, which means it has to create appetites for products, since the basic necessities of life finally can be satisfied one time around. How many shoes do you need, after all? How much food has to be in the larder? How many shirts can you get through a week with, and so forth? How many toothbrushes? How many cars can you cram into that garage? In time, you finally have to start producing things utterly unrelated to any consideration of survival. So you must create consumerism. You must create a consumer ethos. And to do this, of course, you have to rely on certain characteristics of individuals that render them ever more pliable, ever more concerned with considerations of status and class. So class structure becomes an integral part of a capitalist economy because it has to do with the most basic impulse, and that's the one of self-identity, one's self-image, one's sense of fellowship and worth. You know, I am what I buy. No, I am what I am able to buy. Now, the model for this kind of psychology Marx draws from the history of religions. He famously declared religion to be the, quote, opiate of the masses. Now, I've sometimes said to students that, in fact, for the better part of 3/4 of a century, Marx's teaching, at least as rendered by Mao, Stalin, Lenin and company, really functioned precisely as an opiate. Staggeringly large numbers of persons put up with a form of life that many would have revolted against, and put up with it not merely because there were tanks on the street, but because they accepted a theory according to which that form of life was a necessary stage in some alleged evolutionary process. Now, this is a kind of self-numbing, a kind of intellectual numbing that religion has rarely achieved, and I might say rarely attempted to achieve. But what did Marx have in mind in condemning religion as an opiate of the masses? Well, he was a revolutionary within a world of powerful centers committed to the status quo. The great obstacle to a revolutionary enterprise is complacency. And one source of complacency is the belief that prevailing conditions are natural or right or divinely ordained. If you are convinced that your current situation is but an instance in an immensity of time, and that all the important things are going to happen after this purely meager earthly interval, well, you've already become tolerant of your situation in life. Religion redirects focus from the here and now to the then and the there is untouchable, and the then is unreachable until you perform that necessary act of dying. So the opiate effect is this: you begin to take less seriously the day-to-day affairs of your life, and you begin to place the highest premium on a set of values that inevitably are promulgated by classes above your own. It's the masses who find religion to be an opiate. The upper classes, the most influential classes, the moneyed classes, the aristocratic classes, don't have particularly good records of religious credulity. This is where you find skeptical philosophers, cynics, men of the world. But the churches are just the right place to have people reassured that there's some future reward that will be theirs. So Marx sees not just a convenient aid to a particular economic system, but a deliberate, motivated attempt on the part of the powers to keep the masses in place through some sort of mythos, a set of rites and rituals, a set of superstitions, futuristic promises, all of it grounded in something absolutely unreal but entirely serviceable for the purposes. Now you begin to change this only by recognizing that you're a victim of it. The class consciousness becomes the necessary engine of revolutionary change and progress. The first thing you've got to recognize is that you've been exploited, that you're being manipulated, that in fact those who are availing themselves of your labor are doing and paying you wages are doing so not in your interest, but in the interest of preserving a system in which they happen to be successful. Their success depends centrally on your failure to change anything materially about the nature of your life and social arrangements. So what is needed, of course, is a revolutionary change. And that revolution cannot be bloodless, because the powers are not relinquishing power. Those in power do not relinquish power. Power is taken from them. Revolutionary upheavals, then, are the only basis upon which an economic and social stasis is impelled to change, and indeed compelled to change. In the ordinary run of things, science and technology alone radically alter the means of production. If you step back from this for a moment, forget the drama of classes in conflict and vulgar capitalists attempting to amass wealth, Just step back for a moment and consider how the world of the late Renaissance and 17th century, the realms of science and technology, how those worlds were changed by science and technology, how the cotton gin changes things, or an automobile. Marx provides a theory that really leaves no room at all for the revolutionary changes brought about technically and scientifically, without any blood being let at all. And as far as the static status of a laboring class, consider only the Western democracies of the past century to see how mobile persons are within that framework. His is a deterministic theory, and this inevitably is defeated by actual persons living real lives according to terms they articulate for themselves.